Today I have two Nintendo Switches. Neither one of them fully work. This one has an LCD display issue and this one's missing the P13 chip. I've worked on both previously. I'll link both videos above if you want to check those out. But today I'm going to see if I can try and swap over certain parts so that we can get at least one fully working Nintendo Switch. Okay, so a little background. I worked on this Nintendo Switch first, and the problem was it had an inductor that had fallen off. So I replaced the inductor, or I fixed the inductor, not very well. And then when I got the console to turn on, I noticed that the display had a darkening around the area. I don't know if this is the screen or the ribbon cable having some issues, but I'm going to clean that ribbon cable out because it did have some corrosion on it and I didn't fully clean it out, but we'll see if doing this fixes anything. I'm also going to take the inductor that is on here because it's not a well done inductor, and I'm going to replace it with the inductor that's in here that is intact. So this one's kind of going to get started to be used as a parts board, I think. But to get started, we need to tear these both down. Okay, now that we have our two boards out of our two chassis, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to replace this inductor, which had fallen apart, and yeah, I replaced it and it works, but it's not on there well. So I'm going to replace it with this nice intact inductor. And then I'm going to, again, clean out this ribbon connector because I do think that that ribbon connector is a little bit corroded. So I'm going to come in here and try and clean that up. And if not, I might just have to replace it. All right, now that we have the good working board, but with the bad inductor on here, let's remove this inductor and this little heat pad here. We'll remove the inductor and we'll put the intact inductor. You can see here that I just kind of had to solder it on and it's broken from the legs. So that's where our problem comes from. Come in with some flux. Probably just pull it off by melting the solder here, because it's not well attached, as you can see. Probably the best way is to use hot air, but there we go. Easy. Clean those two pads up a little bit more. There we go. There we go. Now we're good to go. Not gonna need much solder on here, I imagine. There we go. Now, for the other board, there's our good working and intact. Some solder, some flux around the legs. There we go. And that came off easily enough. And is intact. Very, very thin little pads here, man. You gotta be really careful pulling that off, actually, because those are just really thin pieces of metal. So that's just the solder that was on there. There we go. Slid right into place as it should. Now, let's clean up after ourselves. Now we have a fresh new inductor that shouldn't fall off if someone drops it just a tiny bit, you know? Yeah, that's well attached. Good. Now I need to turn our attention to this guy right here. Still, yeah. Still some decent corrosion around that. So this is what we're gonna do. So I'm gonna try just giving it a good scrubbing with a toothbrush. Okay, at first I try adding a little bit of IPA with a toothbrush to clean out the corrosion underneath the LCD connector. And even after doing that, I still see that there is this, you know, the green kind of corrosion on some of the pins. So one trick I try is to add some flux to it and use that to scrub, because flux is a little bit more corrosive and it can kind of get in there and maybe help dislodge some of it. Then go over it with the toothbrush, scrubbing it in there. You just want to remember, if you try this, that you really need to come back in again with IPA to remove that flux. You don't want to just sitting there being corrosive to the rest of the board. It's kind of a first step in the process if you really want to try and save the part without having to replace it. Not sure how often it'll work or how much it'll help. Depends really on how much corrosion is in there. And as you'll see in a little bit, there's a lot more corrosion underneath that ribbon cable than appears. Okay, well, first thing we're gonna do is just test it out. See how it works in the new chassis. See if it makes any difference. And we'll go from there. If it works, that's great. And if it still has some artifacts, then we'll know that this connector is causing us some issues. All right, now I have the switch put back together enough to test it out. Let's see how it does. It does turn on, and the screen does look a little still ganky, doesn't it? Yeah, still got a little bit of issues with it. It's not got the darkening around the edge that the other one had, but it does still have some weird artifacts. So yeah, they're kind of coming through on there. So that to me tells me that the other screen with the darkening around the edges was the LCD screen itself being damaged, and these artifacts are caused by the connector having some corrosion on it, probably disrupting the signal. So unfortunately, I think that means I'm pressing on the cable right now, and it's kind of changing, as you can see. Well, it was. There we go. Yeah. So I think the best bet to do would be to go in there and replace that connector, unfortunately. Okay, so since cleaning the ribbon cable didn't fully fix the problem, I've decided to remove the ribbon cable and try and replace it. I really had a hard time with this replacement. I don't know exactly. This is the first time I've ever tried to replace this ribbon cable, or any ribbon cable really. So I don't know exactly what my issue was, but I had the heat decently high up on my hot air station, and it just seemed like that ribbon connector would not come loose. It would just, the solder underneath would not melt. I think on retrospective, maybe there was just I think the corrosion underneath it really hindered the ability of the hot air to melt the station. You know, it provides, the corrosion will provide a little bit of resistance and a little bit of a barrier between the heat and the solder. So kind of like wraps it in this not really protective, but protective layer that I think wicks away the heat. So it made it really hard for the connector to come off, and ended up that the connector started to kind of, even though I was heating it from underneath, it really started to melt. it started to come off, but then in my frustration, I started to pull it off. And of course, that's not where you want it to get. You want it to come off cleanly. That didn't happen to me, but once I did get it off, or at least half of the connector off, you can really see that the underneath it was a lot more corroded than it appeared, especially on the, well, in this view it's the lower half, but you can see on the connector just how corroded it is. And I think that really caused some problems to the pads and made it more of a challenge. And the challenge I had after this was actually getting the solder to stick to those pads. They were so covered in this thin layer of corrosion that they wouldn't take the solder. They were hot enough to do it. My iron was doing it fine for other pads, but certain pads just were not taking the solder. No matter how much flux I put on there, no matter how much I tried, I would have to come in and clean up the, you know, the pads were there. I was able to test them and make sure that there is still some connectivity there, but they were so covered in this corrosion that it made it really a pain. I would have to come in with my tweezers and scrape away at it, and I was really afraid that I was going to, you know, scrape away an entire pad. I've done that before, and I was really trying not to do that, but they just would not take the solder. And then when I do get that other leftover piece off, of course it takes a pad with it, so that makes it great. But it didn't rip it too bad. I was able to kind of reattach it and put a little solder mask over it to hold it in place. I think that actually was a pretty decent trace repair in that situation. And as I work to get solder attached to the other ones, you can see that some of the pad will get solder on it, but then the rest of it wouldn't, because it's just that layer of corrosion. You can't even really see it, I guess, at this point. It's just making all of this work a lot more tedious than it should have been. But of course, I managed to pull up a little bit of a pad there too, so I have to come in and add some solder mask to that and cover it up. It feels like most of the pads have some solder on it, but I try and attach the new connector and come in with the heat from below as I did before. And I think actually, you know, it wasn't too bad. It did look like it set down pretty good in the solder. Unfortunately, after all of this work, and I've sped it up a lot just to save you guys the pain, when I tried to test it, the system did not work any better. Okay, now for the moment of truth. Did I kill it or did I fix it? Because that's really the only two options we have. Oh, yeah. I did worry at this point that I might have destroyed the switch, beyond repair for me, because I was afraid that I might have, I had to apply a lot of heat to get that connector off. So I was worried that I might have put too much heat and killed either like the NAND or the CPU. So I was a little afraid. I obviously had made the screen a lot worse. At least I had a decent picture, if not for a few artifacts. Now I have no picture at all, and I can't tell if the switch is even turning on. But I put it into the dock and it does turn on still. So the only problem is with that connector, and I think it is still salvageable. The switch still works. I think a more skilled technician would be able to fix this, and I might give it another go, but for now I'm going to call this one done because that was a lot of work trying to get that connector in place. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something useful. I think the key takeaway for me is that replacing these connectors are a lot harder than it sometimes looks, and there's always seems to be something that you run into that you weren't expecting, whether it's corrosion that makes it more difficult, I'm assuming that's what it was, or, a mistake you make here and there that tears a pad and makes the whole process a lot harder. Yeah, well, I do want to say I've reached 1,000 subscribers, which is mind-blowing. I want to just thank everyone who subscribes to the channel. Like, it just amazes me that even 1,000 people would subscribe and watch my content. I know I'm not the best technician out there. I'm not the most entertaining, but I try to add some value to the repair world and some, awareness for those who might not be aware of it, or just to show someone who's new to this that there are other people new out there and they also, yes, make mistakes like I do often enough. So don't beat yourself up over it. If you do make mistakes, it happens. It's part of the learning process. I hope we can continue to learn together. Thank you.